Hey, I'm Sterling Walker, and this is my presentation for Intro to American Government, and I will be discussing my thoughts and opinions on the PBS Frontline documentary, America's Great Divide. And one thing that I think is kind of a consideration going in is that even though it is a documentary, and a quite informative one, it is still a kind of media. And as much as they talked about the impact of the media on current events and the ability of the media to frame things into a certain light, uh, they're still media themselves, and I think do fall a little victim to the tendency to play things up to gain that extra entertainment value. And I think the way they did this is they just really tried to portray everything as being very solemn and emphasize the seriousness of what was going on. And while the issues they discussed, of course, are very serious events and do have a massive impact on the country, they just really seemed determined to fit everything into this very somber lens. And to reinforce this, they of course had just serious, very intense, kind of weighty music playing, while everything was going on. And I think there were a few points where that serious tone almost kind of flipped itself on its head in a sort of funny way. I think when they had sound bites of Sarah Palin talking, she just has a goofy, kind of comical voice. And to hear that juxtaposed with this intense music, I thought was kind of funny. Especially also in part one, especially, there was a lot of slow zooms on sad Obama. And then in part two, I think there was kind of a leaning to almost show Trump as like this evil genius. And there certainly is quite a bit of intuition and maybe a level of genius to take the strategy that Trump did to gain his political support and to recognize the division in the country and figure out a way to exploit that for political gain. A lot of people don't see Trump as this massive brainiac. A lot of people don't think he's very intelligent and or especially competent. I've even heard some people kind of say there's a debate among people who don't support Trump as to whether he's evil or stupid. And the documentary I sort of took more the side of focusing on his poor morals as opposed to some of his more errant, kind of humorous public speaking flubs. Another thing that I think was kind of interesting about the approach the documentary took is they didn't necessarily show things in a balanced manner, but I think that that's actually a little closer to the truth. And I do think that the right-wing Republicans and Trump are the ones that are more responsible to being stubborn, drifting further in the other direction, and kind of pulling this divide to be even greater. If anything, I think there may have even been a few points where the documentary did kind of drift towards the middle to make it more of a entertaining, fair fight. And I think one example of this is in President Obama's White House Correspondents' Dinner, in which he gave Trump quite the roasting. Even though they didn't outright say it, they seemed to kind of make it seem like this was a very divisive and contentious move, when personally I thought it was in decent taste and was admittedly pretty funny. And on the subject of the birther movement that was happening around this time, I think that, if anything, strengthens the case that the right wing oftentimes was more responsible for this division, as the documentary covered, and that, even after President Obama had released his birth certificate multiple times and released extra information even about the hospital where he was born at, people just ignored it and refused to buy it and were just convinced that their way was what was true and that President Obama wasn't born in the United States. Also, something that I think was kind of interesting was the presence of Steve Bannon and some of Trump's other advisors, and even though they did kind of undercut them many times and they'd give them a speaking a bit and turn around and criticize Trump, I think it was kind of interesting that, you know, they gave these people who have pretty, you know, questionable moral decisions that have affected the country speaking time in a documentary, which I think may have come from a place of trust in the audience to hear these people talk and still recognize that maybe these aren't people worth listening to. And because again, the documentary did still overall take the tone of recognizing the negative impact that Trump and many of the politicians around him have had on the country. So those are my thoughts on the video. Thanks for listening, and stay safe.